In the vast tapestry of biblical narrative, where patriarchs and prophets occupy center stage with their dramatic stories of faith and failure, of covenant and consequence, there exists a figure so mysterious, so enigmatic, so deliberately obscured by the sparse treatment the text gives him, that his very presence in the scriptural record seems designed to provoke questions that the text itself refuses to answer. Questions that have haunted interpreters for millennia and that continue to generate speculation and wonder among those who sense that there is something profoundly significant about this character whose appearance is so brief, yet whose impact is so enduring that he is referenced across both testaments as a type of priesthood that transcends the Levitical order and that points towards something greater than anything the Mosaic system could offer. Melchizedek appears in Genesis 14 for merely 3 verses, emerging from nowhere, with no genealogy, no backstory, no explanation of how he came to be king of Salem and priest of God Most High, performing his mysterious ministry to Abraham, and then disappearing from the narrative as suddenly as he appeared, leaving behind more questions than answers, and inaugurating a tradition of interpretation that would span thousands of years, and that would find its culmination in the New Testament's assertion that Jesus himself is a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. An assertion whose full significance cannot be grasped without understanding who this mysterious figure was and what his brief encounter with Abraham signified in the grand scheme of redemptive history that stretches from creation to consummation, and that includes within its scope every event, every person, every detail that the biblical text records as significant for understanding what God is doing in the world and how he is accomplishing his purposes through human instruments who frequently do not understand the full significance of what they are doing even as they do it. Before we delve into the depths of this mystery that has captivated scholars and mystics alike across the centuries, I need you to do 3 things that will align your receptivity with the frequency at which this revelation is being transmitted. Subscribe to this channel immediately, like this video, and write in the comments, "I receive the hidden wisdom," to declare your openness to understanding what has been concealed in plain sight within the biblical text for millennia. Waiting for those with eyes to see and ears to hear what the Spirit reveals to those who approach the Scriptures, not as dead letters to be analyzed academically, but as living words that contain depths of meaning that only progressive revelation can unfold for those who are ready to receive what they could not have received before they were ready. The mystery of Melchizedek is not merely historical curiosity about an obscure figure from the patriarchal age. It is key to understanding the nature of spiritual authority, the structure of divine blessing, and the relationship between the visible institutions that mediate divine presence and the invisible realities that those institutions point toward but cannot contain. Realities that existed before the institutions were established and that will continue to exist after the institutions have served their purpose and passed away. Realities that Melchizedek embodied in his person and in his ministry, and that he transmitted to Abraham in an encounter whose significance far exceeded what appeared on the surface to those who witnessed it without understanding what they were witnessing. The setting for Melchizedek's appearance is Abraham's return from a military campaign that was itself remarkable. A campaign in which this nomadic herdsman with no military training and no standing army defeated a coalition of 4 kings who had conquered the 5 cities of the plain and had taken Lot, Abraham's nephew, captive, along with all his possessions. Abraham armed his 318 trained servants and pursued the conquering kings all the way to Dan, divided his forces for a night attack, routed them completely, and recovered all the people and possessions they had taken. a victory so improbable that it could only be attributed to divine intervention on behalf of this man, whom God had called out of Ur, and to whom God had made promises that seemed impossible given his circumstances, but that were being progressively fulfilled through events that demonstrated that the God who makes promises is also the God who keeps them, regardless of how impossible the keeping may seem from human perspectives that cannot see what God sees and that cannot do what God does. It is in the aftermath of this victory, as Abraham returns with the spoils of war and the rescued captives, that Melchizedek appears. And the timing is not accidental, because the timing is never accidental in the biblical narrative, where every detail is significant, and where the placement of events in relation to other events is itself a form of communication that reveals meanings that would not be communicated if the events were placed differently or if they occurred in isolation from the other events that give them their context and their significance. Melchizedek comes out to meet Abraham, bringing bread and wine, elements that would later become central to Jewish and Christian worship, and that here appear for the first time in Scripture in connection with priestly ministry, suggesting that what Melchizedek was doing was not merely offering refreshment to a weary warrior, but was performing a ritual act whose significance transcended the immediate practical function of providing food and drink after battle. The bread and wine that Melchizedek brought were sacramental before the concept of sacrament had been formally articulated, were Eucharistic before there was Eucharist, were pointing towards something that would only be fully revealed millennia later, when another priest after the order of Melchizedek would take bread and wine and invest them with meaning that would transform them into vehicles of divine presence for all who would receive them in faith. This is the first indication that Melchizedek's ministry operates on multiple levels simultaneously, that what appears on the surface is not the whole of what is occurring, that there are depths beneath the surface that the surface conceals even as it reveals, depths that can only be perceived by those who have been given the keys to interpret what they are seeing in light of what the surface alone cannot show them, but what the depths, once accessed, reveal as having been present all along, waiting to be discovered by those with the capacity to discover them. The identity of Melchizedek has been the subject of intense speculation throughout the history of biblical interpretation, with proposals ranging from the mundane to the fantastic, from seeing him as simply a Canaanite king who happened to worship the true God to seeing him as a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself, to seeing him as an angelic being of the highest order, to seeing him as Shem, the son of Noah, who according to the biblical chronology would still have been alive during Abraham's time and who could have transmitted the knowledge of the true God from the pre-flood world to the post-flood world through his own person. Each of these interpretations has its advocates, and each has textual and theological considerations that can be marshaled in its support. And the fact that the debate has continued for millennia without resolution suggests that the text itself is designed to resist definitive identification, to maintain a degree of mystery that provokes ongoing reflection and that prevents the reduction of Melchizedek to any single interpretive category that would domesticate his strangeness and neutralize the questions that his appearance raises about the nature of priesthood, the sources of spiritual authority, and the relationship between the particular covenant that God made with Abraham and the universal relationship that God has with all humanity through figures like Melchizedek, who stand outside the Abrahamic covenant, yet who clearly serve the same God and who exercise legitimate spiritual authority that even Abraham recognizes and submits to. The name Melchizedek itself is significant and contains within it a theological claim that the text presents without commentary, but that interpreters have recognized as central to understanding who this figure is and what he represents. Melchizedek means King of Righteousness in Hebrew, and his title as King of Salem means King of Peace, since Salem is related to the Hebrew word shalom, which encompasses not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of wholeness, completeness, well-being, flourishing in all dimensions of existence. To be simultaneously King of Righteousness and King of Peace is to embody in one's person and one's rule the two qualities that the prophets would later identify as the defining characteristics of the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom where righteousness and peace would kiss each other according to Psalm 85, the kingdom where the Prince of Peace would reign on David's throne, establishing it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever according to Isaiah 9. Melchizedek is thus a type of the Messiah not merely in his priestly function, but in his royal function as well, uniting in his person the offices of priest and king that would later be separated in Israel, with kings coming from Judah and priests coming from Levi, and with strict prohibitions against mixing the two offices that several Israelite kings violated to their detriment when they attempted to perform priestly functions that were not theirs to perform. The blessing that Melchizedek pronounced over Abraham is recorded in Genesis 14:19-20 and contains elements that reveal the nature of Melchizedek's authority and the source from which that authority derives. Elements that have profound implications for understanding the structure of spiritual blessing and the channels through which divine favor flows from its ultimate source to its human recipients. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, Creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. This blessing moves in two directions simultaneously. Blessing Abraham in the name of God, and blessing God for what he has done for Abraham, and this bidirectional movement is characteristic of priestly ministry, which mediates between the divine and the human, bringing divine blessing down to humans and lifting human worship up to God, standing in the gap between realms that cannot directly contact each other without mediation, and providing the bridge across which traffic can flow in both directions. The priest is not merely a functionary who performs rituals mechanically, but is a living conduit through whom spiritual power flows, a channel that must be open in both directions if the mediation is to function correctly. Receiving from above to give below, and receiving from below to offer above in an endless circulation of blessing and worship that connects heaven and earth through the person of the one who stands between them and who belongs to both realms, without being fully contained by either. The title that Melchizedek uses for God, El Elyon, or God Most High, is significant because it is a title that emphasizes divine supremacy over all other powers, divine sovereignty that extends over everything that exists, and the additional descriptor, Creator of heaven and earth, reinforces this emphasis on absolute divine authority that derives from the fact that God made everything and therefore has rights over everything that he made, rights that no other being can claim, because no other being participated in the act of creation that establishes those rights. This is not a tribal deity that Melchizedek serves, not a local god limited to a particular territory or a particular people, but the supreme God who made all territories and all peoples, and who therefore has authority over all of them, regardless of whether they acknowledge his authority or not. The universality of El Elyon's dominion is implicit in the title itself and becomes explicit in the descriptor that follows. And this universality is crucial for understanding why Melchizedek's priesthood can operate outside the boundaries of any particular covenant community, why he can be priest of the true God without being part of Abraham's family or later part of Israel, why his priesthood represents something that transcends the particularities of the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants while being entirely compatible with them and indeed being acknowledged by them as legitimate and superior. What is remarkable about this blessing is that Melchizedek, who is not part of Abraham's family and who appears to have no prior relationship with Abraham, exercises authority to bless him in terms that Abraham accepts without question, and not only accepts, but responds to, by giving Melchizedek a tithe of everything he had recovered from the defeated kings. This response is crucial for understanding the relationship that is being established here, because tithing is an act of acknowledgement that the one to whom the tithe is given has superior spiritual authority, is mediator of divine blessing, is representative of the God in whose name the tithe is ultimately given. Abraham, who is himself the recipient of divine promises and the channel through whom all nations will be blessed, here acknowledges that Melchizedek occupies a position of spiritual authority that is superior to his own, that Melchizedek's priesthood is something that Abraham's calling does not include and cannot replace, that there is a dimension of divine ministry that Abraham needs to receive from someone else, because it is not his to perform for himself. This is the silent authority behind Abraham's blessing, the priestly dimension that operates alongside the prophetic and royal dimensions that Abraham embodies, but that is distinct from them and that cannot be reduced to them. The authority to bless in the name of God Most High that Melchizedek exercises and that Abraham receives with the humility of one who knows that there are aspects of divine ministry that are not his to perform, regardless of how great his own calling may be. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament picks up on this dynamic and makes explicit what is implicit in the Genesis narrative, arguing that the fact that Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek demonstrates the superiority of Melchizedek's priesthood, not only over Abraham, but over all of Abraham's descendants, including the Levitical priests who would later be established by the Mosaic law as the official mediators of divine blessing in Israel. The argument is that Levi, the ancestor of all the Levitical priests, was still in Abraham's body when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, and therefore Levi himself, through Abraham, paid tithes to Melchizedek, acknowledging by that act the superiority of Melchizedek's priesthood over the priesthood that would later descend from Levi. This is a remarkable argument that establishes a hierarchy of priesthoods with Melchizedek's order at the top, the Levitical order below it, and all other forms of spiritual mediation ranked according to their relationship to these two paradigmatic orders. The implications are profound because they suggest that the Levitical system that dominated Israelite religion for over 1,000 years was never the highest form of priesthood available, was always subordinate to an older and higher form that predated it, and that continued to exist as a kind of template against which the Levitical system could be measured and found wanting. Not because the Levitical system was bad, but because it was temporary and provisional and pointed toward something greater that it could not itself provide. The silence of the Genesis text about Melchizedek's origins is not accidental, but deliberate, not deficiency, but design, because the silence itself communicates something that explicit information could not communicate, namely that Melchizedek's priesthood is not derived from genealogy, is not inherited from ancestors, is not dependent on the biological continuities that determine who can and who cannot serve as priest in systems like the Levitical system, where priestly status is entirely determined by descent from Aaron. Hebrews makes this argument explicitly, noting that Melchizedek is without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God. He remains a priest forever. This does not mean that Melchizedek was literally without parents or that he never died, but rather that the biblical text deliberately omits this information to create a literary portrait of a priesthood that transcends the biological limitations that constrain the Levitical priesthood. A priesthood that is based on something other than genealogy, and that therefore can be occupied by someone from any tribe, including someone from the tribe of Judah, from which no one has ever served at the altar according to the Levitical regulations. The silence speaks, And what it speaks is the possibility of a priesthood that is not limited by the constraints that limit the only priesthood that Israel knew under the law. A priesthood that Jesus could occupy despite not being a Levite, because it is not Levitical descent that qualifies for this priesthood, but something else, something that Melchizedek embodied and that Jesus embodies, something that makes them both priests forever, according to an order that predates Levi, and that will outlast the Levitical order that has already passed away with the destruction of the temple and the cessation of the sacrificial system that depended on that temple. The encounter between Abraham and Melchizedek also has implications for understanding the relationship between Israel's particular calling and God's universal purposes, implications that are sometimes overlooked by interpretations that focus exclusively on Israel as God's chosen people without recognizing that God's choice of Israel was never meant to exclude the nations, but rather to be the means through which the nations would eventually be blessed. Melchizedek represents the nations, represents the possibility of authentic relationship with the true God, outside the boundaries of the covenant community that would later be established through Abraham's descendants, represents the continuing validity of primordial religion that predates the Abrahamic covenant and that was never invalidated by that covenant, but rather was fulfilled and completed by it in ways that preserved what was valid in the primordial tradition while adding the particular elements that the Abrahamic covenant introduced. The fact that Abraham, the father of the covenant people, acknowledges Melchizedek's authority and receives his blessing is testimony that the covenant does not create spiritual reality ex nihilo, but rather enters into a spiritual reality that already existed and that continues to exist alongside the covenant. A reality in which figures like Melchizedek operate legitimately and effectively as priests of God, Most High, even without the specific revelation that was given to Abraham and his descendants. The theological significance of Melchizedek's priesthood extends far beyond the historical encounter with Abraham, to establish a paradigm for understanding how divine authority operates in the world and how blessing flows from its ultimate source through mediating channels to those who receive it. A paradigm that challenges many assumptions that religious people make about the exclusivity of their own traditions and about the necessity of belonging to specific institutional structures in order to have access to authentic spiritual reality. Melchizedek demonstrates that there was legitimate priesthood before there was Israel, that there was authentic worship of the true God before there was Torah, that there was effective mediation between heaven and earth before there were temples and sacrifices, and all the elaborate apparatus that would later be established under the Mosaic covenant to regulate how humans approach God and how God approaches humans. This is not to diminish the significance of the Mosaic system, which was divinely ordained and which served essential purposes in the history of redemption, but it is to recognize that the Mosaic system was not the first word on priesthood, nor would it be the last word, that it was inserted into a history that had already seen legitimate priestly ministry and that would see such ministry again after the Mosaic system had served its purpose and been superseded by something greater that the Mosaic system itself anticipated and pointed toward, but could not itself provide. The implications of this for understanding the nature of spiritual authority are profound and unsettling for those who locate such authority exclusively in institutional structures that claim monopoly on access to God and on the power to bless or to curse, to include or to exclude, to define who is in and who is out of the community of the saved. Melchizedek had no institution behind him, belonged to no visible organization that we can identify, received his priesthood from no human source that the text names or even implies, Yet his priesthood was real and effective and superior to anything that institutional religion would later produce, including the priesthood of Israel, which was the most elaborately developed and most divinely sanctioned priesthood that the ancient world knew. If Melchizedek could be priest of God Most High without institutional credentials, without organizational backing, without the visible markers that humans typically use to identify legitimate spiritual authority, then the question arises whether such credentials and backing and markers are as essential as those who possess them claim they are. Whether there might be authentic priestly ministry operating outside the boundaries of established religious institutions that those institutions cannot recognize, because it does not bear the marks that they have determined are necessary for legitimacy. This is not to say that institutions are worthless or that anyone who claims spiritual authority has it regardless of credentials, but it is to say that the ultimate source of spiritual authority is not human institution, but divine appointment, and that divine appointment can operate through channels that human institutions do not control and cannot validate, because the appointment comes from a level that transcends institutional authorization. The order of Melchizedek, as it is called in Psalm 110 and in the book of Hebrews, represents a type of priesthood that is characterized by several features that distinguish it from the Levitical priesthood, and that make it the appropriate priesthood for the Messiah who would fulfill all the types and shadows of the Old Covenant in his own person and ministry. First, it is a priesthood based on divine oath rather than on genealogical descent. Psalm 110. Paul records God swearing an oath that the Messianic king will be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And Hebrews emphasizes that this oath, unlike the regulations that establish the Levitical priesthood, is irrevocable and eternal, establishing a priesthood that cannot be terminated by death or disqualified by physical defect or superseded by institutional reorganization. The Levitical priests served according to the law of a fleshly commandment, as Hebrews puts it, meaning that their priesthood was established by regulations that pertain to physical realities like genealogy and bodily wholeness and ritual purity. But the Melchizedekian priest serves according to the power of an indestructible life, meaning that his priesthood is established by spiritual realities that transcend the physical, and that therefore cannot be affected by physical limitations that would disqualify a Levitical priest from service. Second, the order of Melchizedek is a priesthood that combines royal and priestly functions in one person, something that the Mosaic law explicitly prohibited for Israel, where kings came from Judah and priests came from Levi, and the two offices were kept strictly separate, with severe consequences for kings who attempted to usurp priestly prerogatives. Melchizedek was both king of Salem and priest of God Most High, and this union of offices in his person anticipated the union that would be fully realized in the Messiah, who would be both the Davidic king promised to Israel and the eternal high priest, who would offer the sacrifice that would end all sacrifices by accomplishing once for all what the repeated sacrifices of the Levitical system could never accomplish, namely the permanent removal of sin and the permanent opening of access to God's presence that the Old Covenant sacrifices could only symbolize but could not actually effect. The separation of king and priest in Israel was temporary measure necessitated by the imperfection of both kings and priests, who could not be trusted with both powers simultaneously. But the reunion of the offices in the Messiah represents the restoration of the original pattern that Melchizedek embodied, and that will characterize the eternal kingdom, where the one who sits on the throne is also the one who mediates between God and humanity, requiring no other mediator, because he is himself both God and man, both king and priest, both the one who rules and the one who reconciles. Third, the order of Melchizedek is a priesthood that ministers bread and wine rather than animal sacrifices, and this distinction between the offerings of Melchizedek and the offerings of the Levitical priests points toward the nature of the sacrifice that the ultimate Melchizedekian priest would offer. The Levitical sacrifices involved the death of animals whose blood was shed and whose bodies were burned on the altar. And this shedding of blood was essential to the Levitical system because without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness, according to the law. But the bread and wine that Melchizedek offered pointed toward a different kind of sacrifice. A sacrifice that would involve the body and blood of the priest himself rather than the body and blood of animal substitutes. A sacrifice that Jesus would institute at the Last Supper when he took bread and said, "This is my body," and took wine and said, "This is my blood of the new covenant which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." 3. The Melchizedekian elements of bread and wine thus find their fulfillment in the Eucharist, which is the ongoing memorial of Christ's sacrifice, the means by which the benefits of that sacrifice are communicated to believers who receive by faith what the elements signify and convey. The perpetual participation in the body and blood of the great high priest, who offered himself once for all, and who continues to minister the benefits of his sacrifice to all who come to God through him. Fourth, the order of Melchizedek is a priesthood that is universal in scope, rather than limited to a particular nation or a particular people. Melchizedek was not an Israelite because Israel did not yet exist, was not a Jew because that designation would not be applied until millennia later, was simply a human being who served the true God and who exercised priestly ministry that was effective and legitimate without any of the ethnic or national qualifications that would later be required for Levitical priesthood. This universality is crucial for understanding why the Melchizedekian priesthood is appropriate for the Messiah, whose ministry is not limited to Israel, but extends to all nations, whose sacrifice is not offered for Jews only, but for the sins of the whole world, whose intercession is not on behalf of one people, but on behalf of all who come to God through him, regardless of their ethnic or national origin. The particularity of the Levitical priesthood served purposes in the history of redemption, maintaining the distinctiveness of Israel as the people through whom the Messiah would come and through whom the knowledge of the true God would be preserved until the time of fulfillment. But that particularity was always meant to serve universal purposes and was never intended to be permanent limitation on who could have access to God and who could not. The Melchizedekian priesthood represents the original universality that preceded Israelite particularity, and that would be restored after Israelite particularity had served its purpose, the priesthood that was always the goal toward which the Levitical priesthood pointed, and that has now been realized in Christ, who is priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The silence that surrounds Melchizedek in the biblical text is itself a form of revelation, communicating through what it does not say as much as through what it says, creating a space of mystery that invites interpretation without permitting closure, that provokes questions without providing definitive answers, that points toward realities that exceed the capacity of language to capture, and that can only be approached through the indirect means of symbol and type and shadow that are the characteristic modes of biblical revelation when it deals with matters that transcend ordinary human experience, and that require transformation of consciousness to be properly understood. The text does not tell us where Melchizedek came from because his priesthood is not derived from earthly origins that could be specified in geographical or genealogical terms. The text does not tell us where Melchizedek went after his encounter with Abraham, because his priesthood does not terminate in earthly endings that could be marked by death dates and burial locations. The text does not tell us how Melchizedek came to know the true God, or how he came to be priest of God Most High, because his priesthood is not the result of processes that could be described in terms of learning and training and ordination as human priesthoods typically are. All of these silences are eloquent, speaking loudly precisely because they do not speak at all, creating through their absence a presence that is more powerful than any presence that explicit information could create, evoking through what they withhold a sense of mystery and transcendence that would be dissipated if the mystery were resolved, and the transcendence brought down to the level of ordinary historical fact. The Jewish interpretive tradition has generated numerous speculations about Melchizedek's identity, with one prominent tradition identifying him with Shem, the son of Noah, who, according to the biblical chronology, would still have been alive during Abraham's time, and who, as the ancestor through whom the blessing of Noah descended, could appropriately be understood as the bearer of priestly authority in the post-flood world. This identification has the advantage of explaining how Melchizedek could be priest of the true God in an age before special revelation had been given to Abraham and his descendants, because Shem would have received the knowledge of God from Noah, who received it from his ancestors, going back ultimately to Adam and Eve, who walked with God in the garden before the fall, and who transmitted the knowledge of him through the godly line of Seth down to Noah and his sons. If Melchizedek is Shem, then his priesthood represents the primordial priesthood that extends back to the beginning of human history, and that was never lost, even though it was obscured by the spread of idolatry that made special revelation necessary for the preservation of true religion in a world that had largely abandoned the original knowledge of God that was humanity's birthright, but that humanity had squandered through rebellion and forgetfulness. The Christian interpretive tradition has sometimes gone further, identifying Melchizedek with the pre-incarnate Christ himself, a theophany or Christophany in which the eternal Son appeared in human form to bless Abraham centuries before he would assume human nature permanently in the incarnation. This interpretation takes seriously the language of Hebrews, which says that Melchizedek was made like the Son of God, and that he remains a priest forever. Language that seems to attribute to Melchizedek characteristics that properly belong only to divine persons, and that therefore might indicate that Melchizedek was not a human being at all, but was the Son of God appearing in temporary human form, as he did on other occasions in the Old Testament when the angel of the Lord appeared and was worshipped and spoke as God because he was God. The second person of the Trinity, appearing before his incarnation, in forms that anticipated the incarnation without being the incarnation itself. This interpretation has the advantage of explaining the extraordinary reverence that Abraham showed to Melchizedek and the extraordinary authority that Melchizedek exercised over Abraham. Because if Melchizedek was the pre-incarnate Christ, then Abraham was encountering his Lord in visible form and responding appropriately to that encounter with the worship and submission that the Lord deserves from all his creatures. Other interpreters have resisted both of these identifications, preferring to see Melchizedek as simply a human being, a Canaanite king who, unlike his contemporaries, had somehow preserved the worship of the true God and who served as priest in that worship in a way that was legitimate, even though it existed outside the covenant community that would later be established through Abraham's descendants. This interpretation has the advantage of maintaining the humanity of Melchizedek, which seems to be assumed by the Genesis text that presents him as king of a city and as participant in the politics of the region, without any indication that he was anything other than a human ruler who happened to have a relationship with God that most of his contemporaries did not share. It also has the advantage of making Melchizedek a genuine type of Christ, rather than Christ himself, because a type must be distinct from the antitype it represents if it is to function as type at all, pointing towards something other than itself, rather than being identical with what it points toward. If Melchizedek was Christ, then he cannot be a type of Christ, because a thing cannot be a type of itself. But if Melchizedek was a human priest, who in various ways foreshadowed the priesthood of Christ, then he functions typologically in the way that other Old Testament figures like Moses and David and Joshua function, pointing toward Christ through their persons and their ministries, while being distinct from Christ and inferior to him in ways that make the typological relationship meaningful. The truth may be that the question of Melchizedek's identity is undecidable by design, that the text deliberately withholds the information that would allow definitive identification, precisely in order to preserve the mystery that makes Melchizedek function as he needs to function in the biblical narrative and in the theological reflection that the narrative generates. Melchizedek needs to be mysterious in order to represent the mysterious dimension of priesthood that transcends the visible and institutional forms that priesthood typically takes. The dimension that the Levitical system could not capture because it was too tied to physical and genealogical realities that are inherently limited and temporary. The dimension that only becomes visible when the limitations are removed, and when priesthood is seen in its pure form as mediation between divine and human, that requires nothing but the divine appointment that constitutes it, and that no human institution can grant or withhold. Perhaps Melchizedek was Shem, perhaps he was a theophany, perhaps he was simply a Canaanite king with unusual spiritual sensitivity, perhaps he was something else entirely that none of our categories can capture. And perhaps the inability to decide between these options is not failure of interpretation, but success of the text in communicating through its silence what it could not communicate through explicit statement, namely that there is a dimension of spiritual reality that exceeds our categories and that can only be approached through wonder and worship rather than through analysis and identification.